Hey everybody, Dave here with part 2 of my GM overview for the Wardens of Wildwood Adventure Path for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. As usual, there's a couple of disclaimers I want to go through before we get into the content here. First of those is that this is part 2, so if you haven't watched part 1, please go do so immediately. Second, there's going to be spoilers abound here. This is a video for GMs who plan to run the Wardens of Wildwood Adventure Path. If you are a player currently or a prospective player, I encourage you to smash that like button and then close the window, move on to a different video, and stop watching this one. Also, I want to just reinforce that I have not played this adventure path. It's pretty much brand new. I'd be surprised if anybody or many people have played all 3 books of them yet. So I'm not going to be able to answer things from a first-person perspective of actually experiencing the campaign, but I have gone through a number of different sources. People who leave comments on the previous video, people who send me their thoughts, things I see on the subreddits and on the official forums and so forth. So I'm going to be pulling a lot of different thoughts from a lot of different places and trying to figure out what are the common themes of both praise and criticism for this campaign and share that in this video. And last, I do need to let you know that I was provided all 3 of these books by Paizo for the purposes of doing a video like this one. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the meat of the conversation. And we're going to start with a little bit of clarifications. So when I do part 1 videos, the first part of all these 2-part GM overviews, the first part is always created with the goal of giving a viewer an idea of what the campaign is about. And it's not going to be, or it's not intended to be, a study of the campaign and the plot and all the different threads in detail. The thought process is if you are a prospective GM, you might be looking at that video to say, is this something I'm interested in or not? I want to give you enough information so that you can decide for yourself if it sounds interesting that you do want to move forward and get more information like in a video like this one, or purchasing the first book and read through it yourself. And I don't want to give a lot of really major spoilers because I'm a GM too, and I know there's times where I take a look at, is this a campaign that I might be interested in running? And if the answer is no, I don't want to know anything about it because my buddy might be GMing it, and I might be a player in that game. And so for those people, I try to leave major surprises unspoiled in that first video. Now, the reason I bring this up is because this is an ongoing battle as I try to balance giving enough information for viewers to come to the decision if the campaign is of interest to them, but without spoiling so much that they wouldn't be able to enjoy it themselves. And so sometimes I might either omit some things or speak in general terms or just blatantly be, maybe dishonest is not the best word. I might do a little white lie to keep something hidden. And that was the case for this campaign. And some people called out and said, Dave, I don't think that that's really what happened. And specifically with regards to the retirement of Valenar the Green. Valenar the Green was at the beginning of the campaign, he is the Archdruid in charge of the lodge, of the Wildwood Lodge. And in the first video, I say he announces his retirement, and in 1 month's time, there will be an election to choose a successor. That's not entirely honest. The correct thing to say there is he is the victim of a terrorist attack, and he opens a bag of with a foul creature inside of it who rips his face off. Like this probably a more correct way of saying it. But for those people who only watched the part 1 video, decide they don't want to run it, I want them to have moments of discovery and surprise when they play it. So I don't tell them that, I didn't say that Valenar the Green got killed, he's murdered. You just say, what's material to that conversation is he's no longer the leader. There's going to be a vote for a new leader, and that new leader is someone who has a radically different view on relations with the surrounding nations, especially Andron and Taldor, than what Valenar did. Now, that person is also another one of those pieces that I kept quiet. I didn't identify who the antagonist of this campaign is. I didn't mention that she was a centaur or that she was an undead Grave Knight centaur, and I didn't mention that she is someone who you can potentially befriend early on in the campaign. And that's specifically why I didn't spoil that piece. Not as an attempt to misinform for any devious reason, but if this is a character who you have your first opportunity to meet in a pleasant gathering, and you have the opportunity to befriend this person, then I don't want to spoil that. Guess what? That's going to end up being the big bad evil guy for the entire campaign. So I say all of that just to reinforce that there's a delicate line that I walk when I make the part 1 videos. I do not intend to misinform, but I am trying to balance giving enough information for a person to decide if this is a campaign they're interested in without spoiling so much that they wouldn't enjoy it as a player. I still want big things to be a big surprise for those people. And that's what part 2 is for. This second part of this video that's exactly what this is for, is to give you those details that are glanced over or navigated away from in part 1. So let's talk about some positive things, some of the things I liked about this campaign. One of the things I really liked is with it being in a mostly self-contained location, the second half of book 3 being an exception, the rest of the campaign takes place there in the woods, in the forest. And so a lot of the NPCs, you build your relationships in book 1, you continue to foster your relationships with those same people throughout book 2 and into book 3 as well. NPCs can come into the storyline and out of the storyline. There is some fluidity to it, but it's not like a lot of these campaigns are you meet the people in the first city, you build relationships with them, and then you leave, and then you go to the next city and you encounter new people and you build relationships with them, and then you go to the next city, and so on and so forth. In Wardens of Wildwood, you can really develop relationships on a level that's uncommon, I think, in Adventure Paths. Season of Ghosts is another one of those exceptions where you really get to know the people because it's self-contained in a small geographic area. But I like that. I think it's good for building personalities and relationships and so on and so forth. Another thing that is good, especially in the first book, is this is not a dungeon crawl. It's not a hack and slasher. It's not a game that is going to cater heavily to the murder hobo community. And as the proud GM of several murder hobos, I don't use that as a disparaging remark, but we have to all recognize that different people play the game for different reasons. And there are a lot of options already on the table for those people who really want to engage in combat and that more visceral aspects of adventuring. And this is one, especially book 1, leans more towards diplomacy, influence challenges, and things of that sort. Now, in book 2, once there's the big reveal of who the big bad evil guy is and what her goals are and so forth, and you get into this conflict between the Root Reft Lodge's resistance against the new leadership of the Wildwood Lodge, there is more traditional adventuring and combat and so forth. But in book 1 in particular, book 1's pretty much bookended by diplomatic pieces. There's the gala at the beginning, there's the vote at the end. Now, in the middle, there's the flashpoints. There's a lot of adventuring and stuff to do in the middle there. But there's just more opportunity for diplomacy and building relationships, and not strictly go to this set piece and kill all the goblins, and then go to this set piece and kill all the kobolds, and then the next set piece and kill all the orcs. It's not that kind of a campaign. I also like that there is a very clear through line that connects all three of these books. So, book one, we're establishing the Wildwood Lodge, we're establishing the Force, we're establishing the areas of concern and potential conflict with the neighboring nations. And then at the end, you have this like sort of cliffhanger ending where a new leader is chosen, and that is Ruzdoya. I'm not entirely sure what the correct pronunciation is, but an undead Grave Knight centaur takes control. Great. We have now identified who our antagonist for the story is. Book 2 flows right into a resistance against her rule. Book 3 flows right into her trying to enact a grand villainous scheme that would have wide consequences for the world. Like, you would want to have huge stakes in an adventure. But this is not a campaign that ever feels like it takes a wild left turn. I think, like, for example, Gatewalkers is a campaign where I felt like not all the authors of all three books were on the same page of the story they were trying to tell, and that's not the case or concern with this one. I think Wardens of Wildwood it has one clear through line through all three books. Another thing I liked is something I mentioned before. You can meet the villain early on. So at the beginning, you go to a gala event at the Wildwood Lodge. There are competitions going on. There's a festival. You get to rub shoulders with some other prominent figures in the community, get to know them, have influence challenges, so on and so forth. One of those figures is a centaur named Ruzadoya. Again, I'm not sure exactly if it's Ruzadoya or Ruzadoya, but in your world, you can pronounce it whichever way you want. You encounter her at this gala festival, and she's just another person you can meet. There's no heavy emphasis on her, but you meet her when she's still living. As I mentioned before, she becomes an undead grave knight. At the beginning of the story, she is mortal, and she's another person in the lodge, and she's a person that has concerns about border security and about the treaties that the lodge has with the neighboring nations, but isn't full-blown evil. We must kill all the humans and elves and so on and so forth. She is a person of strong convictions, but not a mustache-twirling villainess. Now, and so I like the fact that you can meet her, get to know her, potentially befriend her, because then, at the end of the book, or at the end of the first chapter, when Valenar the Green is assassinated, there is what they call, there's a grand massacre that happens, and there's a lot of dead in the wake of that massacre, and one of those people is Ruzadoya. And so, at the end of chapter 1, you met Ruzadoya, you befriended her potentially, possibly. She died in the massacre that kills Valenar the Green, the Archdruid. Chapter 3, you're finally having the votes to choose a new leader, and right before the votes are cast, guess who shows up? It's Ruzadoya. And she's not alive, she's unalive. And she's clearly an undead creature that describes her with sickly colored skin and so forth. And so she's returned from death as a grave knight, and is spurred on by her convictions to protect the forest from the surrounding nations, but her undeath has triggered this metamorphosis into a much more aggressive person in the path of that goal. So anyway, on the list of things I love that you can meet this character, get to know her before she makes the transformation, because I think that could have potentially a greater impact on the player's experience. So now let's get into the areas of concerns, complications, so on and so forth. The first is that this is yet another adventure path that begins with some kind of celebration or festival or what have you. As people have pointed out online, this is becoming a trope similar to like you meet in the local tavern. You know, back in the old like second edition D&D days, that's how all new games started. That was your standard trope. You all meet in the tavern, and there's a wanted poster that says this orc is wanted by the government, so you go on an adventure to go get that orc, whatever. Now it seems to be these adventure paths all start with some kind of celebration. Rise of the Rune Lords does it. I think Agents of Edgewatch does it in like a World's Fair type deal. Sky King's Tomb starts with a storytelling festival. I think maybe Skull in Shackles starts with the Punch Drunk Festival in honor of Caden Kalian. So people have kind of flagged that, like, having this AP start with the Grand Gala and celebration in the forest at the Wildwood Lodge as a plot explanation as to why all these people are gathering here to kick off the adventure is a trope that is beginning to wear a little thin for some people. Now, my point of view is I think that it feels like it's wearing thin on those of us who read every adventure path, because we keep seeing it pop up. But to players who only play, let's say, 2, maybe 3 APs in their career, like, is that, do they encounter these things with such frequency that it is a material harm to their experience? Probably not. But this is something that I found a little bit humorous, but also can associate myself with it. Yeah, this is yet another AP that starts with a grand celebration. Another thing that was flagged by a number of people in the community is there is a minigame called Prismati. So, as part of these celebrations at the beginning of Book 1, at the beginning of the campaign's adventure, there's caber tossing and all kinds of other fun little activities you can do to try to become the champion of the festival, and it's just a fun introduction for people. One of the games you can play there is called Prismati, which I'm just going to say is kind of like, let's call it Quidditch. It's not, you don't fly around on brooms and stuff, but it's an athletic sport that is potentially and probably more complex than the amount of page space is given to explain it in the book. And it just kind of comes across as a great big mess of rules. And several people online point out that if you have a speed score over 25, it kind of breaks it. And you're throwing and catching these colored objects to score points, but it doesn't tell you how many points you get. For whatever it's worth, the Foundry virtual tabletop module awards 3 points when you score. And there's other ways to lose points and so on and so forth. All of that is to say, Prismati is something that has been a thorn in the side of a few GMs in their games. And a lot of people have said, you know what, I'm just not going to fool with Prismati. I'm just going to substitute that with something simple like a javelin throw or something else. If you do want to do Prismati, I would encourage you to really read it several times and make sure you got a real good understanding of how the game works. Because again, that's an area that was flagged by a lot of people as being problematic in their games. Another part of Book 1 that a lot of people are a little confused about, dismayed about, disappointed with, is major plot event. Valenar the Green, the Archdruid, is murdered. Um, the identity of his killer is never revealed. Basically, so the way it works is, as part of the ceremony, a representative of Taldor presents the Archdruid at the festival with, it's either a box or a bag, and has some significance of nature, and they do this exchange. Well, somebody put evil plant monster inside of the container. So when Valenar the Green opens it, he's surprised by, I think they described it as tentacles coming out and grabbing his face and ripping off his flesh, and this turns into a big boss fight with this monster that is now set loose on the gathered crowd. But you never learn definitively who was responsible for that and what their motive was. So, this causes a problem because after the dust settles, a natural response for players is going to be somebody murdered our friend, or potentially our father figure, our leader of this lodge, depending on how you position the players in their relation to the leadership of the lodge. But a lot of them are not just going to want to just say, like, well, that happened, let's just move on with our lives. They want to do an investigation. They want to find the person responsible. They want to bring that person to justice, and they want to have closure on that storyline. The way it's written is basically this was a random act of terrorism that was not connected to Rizadoya or the larger plot that comes out of it. It was a completely random event, and the author of the adventure, I think his name was Andrew White. Yeah, Andrew White. There was a quote of his posted on the official forums. The quote is attributed to him, but I never found the exact source, the original source of the quote. But I'm going to read this to you anyway. Again, this is attributed to the author of Book 1 for the campaign. Who did the thing? The thing in this case being the murder of Valenar the Green. Okay, I'll take responsibility for this one. Our story outline didn't specify who was responsible for the attack, and in fact advised against providing anything more than circumstantial evidence at the scene, since the whole purpose of the inciting event was to set everyone at each other's throats by making it unclear who was to blame. Initially, one of the quests I wrote for Chapter 2 did involve the PCs tracking down the culprit, only to discover that it was a random act of terrorism committed over a personal grudge that had nothing to do with Andoran, Taldor, Zibik, or the Lodge. Zibik I'll talk about in a bit, but Zibik is a green man, sort of a demigod of plant life, who is pivotal in the third book. But the individual responsible would be killed in the confrontation, leaving the PCs without sufficient proof to convince any of the nefarious factions who had already decided who they wanted to hold responsible. That quest ended up getting cut for space, because it didn't move the unrest needle in any meaningful way, and wasn't really what Chapter 2 was supposed to be about anyway, and was replaced by some evidence the PCs could discover that would implicate an NPC killed in the attack, whose methods and motivations would be expanded upon in Book 2. That clearly didn't end up happening, probably also because of space limitations, so that plot thread ended up dangling unresolved forever. I think. I haven't read Book 3 yet. My reading through of Book 3 did not reveal. I did not see identity be provided for the killer in Book 3. I'll just say that. Our intention was to create a when the house is on fire, figuring out who lit the match is secondary at best to extinguishing the flames scenario. But I totally sympathize with the frustration over never actually getting that answer, even if knowing it ultimately wouldn't have changed anything. So those are the words attributed to the author of the first adventure. the person who was responsible for the death of Valenar the Green was never supposed to be a major figure. They had some plot threads in there for an investigation for players because he expected players would want that, but he got cut for space. So you as a GM, you might want to do some thinking and put together a little bit of sort of recreating the scenario that is laid out here by Mr. White to figure out or to give a path to the players to explore who the killer was and get closure on that point. But you will want to do it in such a way that it doesn't lessen the conflict between the factions in the lodge, because that's inherently important to moving the story forward. Now, another thing that was mentioned in that quote was that it quote, didn't move the unrest needle forward. So that is referring to chapter 2 of book 1, where you are managing a number of unrest points that kind of represents the climate in the forest as people are dealing with the shock and the loss of their leader and uncertainty of the future. And the players are tasked with dealing with a number of flashpoints. And dealing with these flashpoints successfully can lower the amount of unrest that's being felt in the area. And that's ultimately how the first chapter ends, is with the players being told, basically, we don't have time to dwell on this. We need you to get out there and take care of these flashpoints that are popping up in the forest. Now, one of the things that's been pointed out by a number of people online is that the book doesn't tell you how many unrest points you start with. It tells you if certain things happen, then you might start with fewer points, but it doesn't tell you fewer points from what. And I haven't seen an official response to this, but a couple of different people online said that they started their chapter 2s of book 1 with 3 unrest points as that default base, and it seemed to work well. Another thing that was called out was there is a area in this chapter 2 of book 1 with these flashpoints called the Viridian Nexus, which is a series of underground tunnels that surround a larger chamber in the center, and there is a Wraith Vine boss at the center of this. And getting to the Wraith Vine for your encounter with it can be difficult because half of the tunnel segments are difficult terrain to medium-sized creatures. These are tunnels that were carved out by roots and vines from this creature. So they're not 6-foot tall tunnels that you can easily walk through. It's difficult terrain for medium-sized creatures to get through half of them. The other half are even smaller and is difficult terrain for a small-sized creature to get through. So medium-sized creatures would have to squeeze through those spaces. Now this becomes a problem when you consider that this adventure path was released kind of side by side with Howl of the Wild, which introduced size-large player characters. So if you're playing a centaur, and you're not the pony centaur, you're the regular centaur, the size-large centaur, how are you going to navigate these tunnels? What complications are you going to have to deal with? There's no guidance given in the book, but the simple community guidance is just say if you've got size-large players, then just say the vines and the roots that made these tunnels are larger, and just make everything one step larger. And you might have to redo some of the maps to make it all fit. But just FYI, if you do it by raw and you have one or even multiple large size characters, that area in chapter 2 of book 1 is going to be a pain point. Another area that was brought up as a point of concern is at the end of the adventure, at the end of book 1, I should say, the players can interact with prospective future leaders of the lodge and generate influence with them and potentially try to position somebody to win the vote. And players are likely going into that trying their best to succeed. not knowing that it really doesn't matter what they do. Ruzadoya is going to show up at the last minute and win all the votes. So this is an area that rubs against player agency a little bit. Um, and some GMs didn't like that, and potentially some players didn't like that. So a couple people rewrote that scene not as Ruzadoya showing up and saying, I'm throwing my hat into the ring. I'm going to run for this position of leader of the lodge. Please vote for me. Instead, just starts a violent coup and uses her full force as a newly minted Grave Knight to make people cower and accept her leadership by force. That's one option. But basically, what's worth mentioning here is simply that it could rub players the wrong way if they invest time and effort into building influence with people to secure them as leaders of the lodge, only to find out none of that matters. Ruzadoya shows up, she gets the votes, she wins. So another thing that felt a little out of place here in this scene where Ruzadoya shows up and puts her name in the hat to become the new leader of the lodge is that she's clearly undead. It describes her as having like sickly looking skin and just overtly is now an undead creature. The last time they saw her, they all saw her die in the massacre a month earlier when Valenar the Green was killed, and now here she's trotting in an undead state, and it just seems odd for a group of druids, even if they sympathize with her message of we have to have stronger borders and we can't just allow the neighboring nations to take our trees for lumber and all of this. Even if they agree with those beliefs, it's weird that they would just so quickly say, you know what, let's take this undead person and make them the leader of the lodge. And that's essentially what happens. So that might be another reason why some people favor to go the violent coup route of Ruzadoya just showing up and enforcing her will on the gathering to be named the new leader, and then exiling everybody who does not agree with her viewpoints, rather than having it be this diplomatic vote where she receives the votes and becomes the leader. So those were the major areas of concern that popped up when I was reviewing online. There are some spoilery bits that I omitted from the first video that I should probably talk about, which is mainly the second half of book 3. So if you watched the first video, which I hope you all did, I ended it with the players in the Root Weft Lodge sort of retaking the Wildwood Lodge and forcing Ruzadoya to flee through a magic portal. And they discover that this magic portal has exactly enough energy to send the player's party after her. And so they all go through the portal to track down Ruzadoya. That's where I ended the first video. So what happens when they go through the portal is they find themselves in the newly re-established or reopened elemental plane of wood. So your players, in their pursuit of Ruzadoya, arrive there. It takes a day for the sages in the lodge to figure out how the portal works, so they don't just hop in on her tail. There is basically a 24-hour period where this is all just for the convenience of plot. Players can get a nice rest, can heal up, but it also allows Ruzadoya to get a head start on the other side of the portal. So when they do go through the portal and they realize they're now in the elemental plane of wood, They enter into a community, and the community is not entirely trusting of people from outside the plane. And so there's a period of working with those people and gathering relations. And ultimately, they know that Rizadoya is seeking a powerful being named Zibik. And so that's where the player's focus is. They want to find a guide, some way to get them to Zibik. Now, in this portion of the elemental plane of wood, there is a terrible blight that is consuming large portions of the plane. And the community, the town that they arrive in, is basically on the border. It's like the first defense against this blight. And this blight is it's a disease. It's a magical disease, a primal disease that that mutates all life it touches. And if it's a living creature that gets the blight, then they become obsessed with nothing but spreading the blight further. And so this blight destroys what it touches, but in its wake leaves the opportunity for rebirth and regrowth, which is viewed as kind of a natural part of the life cycle of plants. People tend to think about the plant life as the portions of it growing and thriving and being healthy, but part of that cycle is also plant life dies and decays, and mold and fungus can come through to large trees and decompose them, and then that all becomes fertile ground for more life to flourish from it. And that is kind of the cycle that Zibik, the Green Man in the Plane of Wood, is fascinated with and has devoted his life to studying, is the portion of the plant life cycle that is decay and renewal. And so he's very interested in this blight and trying to contain the blight and keep it from spreading. He's spent centuries, I believe it says, just trying to keep the blight from spreading all across the elemental plane of wood. But due to his association with this blight, Rizadoya wants to find him and treat with him and encourage him to leave the elemental plane of wood and come travel to, they now call it the universe. I still like to call it the material plane. That just sounds better to me than the universe. But come back to Golarion. And if Zibik does that, the blight will follow with him. And then Rizadoya wants to unleash that blight on Andron and on Taldor and just let it consume as much of those nations as possible. Who knows if it can even be stopped? Maybe it will consume all of them, if not eventually the entire world, possibly, as retribution for their societies cutting down the forest, taking trees for lumber, and so on and so forth. This is their chance to unleash this blight on those nations that would destroy them and, in her view, put into a cycle of rebirth and renewal where trees could then flourish in the wake of this blight. So the second half of book 3, that's really what it's about. It's traveling through the plane of wood to get to Zibik, and it's a bit of a race. Rizadoya wants to get to him to convince him to come to the material plane and unleash these blights, and the players want to, well, first of all, they probably want to kill Rizadoya, because she's been the thorn in their sides for so long, and she's the big bad evil guy in all this, but also would probably want to convince Zibik not to do that. So all of this culminates in a blighted portion of the wood. You'll be dealing with the blight and blighted creatures a lot in the second half of book 3. But ultimately, this culminates into the players reaching Rizadoya and Zibik while she has been treating with him and trying to convince him. it's kind of assumed that Rizadoya and the players will get into a major confrontation, a major fight. And afterwards, after they defeat Rizadoya, there is one final sort of influence challenge with Zibik to convince him to not come to the material plane and unleash this blight. I know alignments are not part of Remastered, but Zibik is not an inherently evil creature. He is largely seems to be a creature that is associated with plant life and encouraging plant life, and doesn't have retribution. Doesn't seem to be part of his soul. But if the players fumble this influence challenge, it could spell disaster. And if they're dumb enough to attack Zibik is, I think he's statted out as a 26th level demigod. That's probably not going to go super well for the players. But that's the end of the campaign that I omitted from the first video. Going to the elemental plane of woods, seeking out Zibik the Green Man, defeating Rizadoya, and convincing Zibik to not travel to the material plane and unleash the blight. So, as for questions that were left in the comments of the previous video, the only one that I haven't really tackled is the same one I always get with Adventure Pass at Orange level 1 to level 20, and that is, what should you run before and what should you run after? Wardens of Wildwood is an odd campaign because it starts at 5th level and it goes to 14th level. So that makes it difficult to fit in the normal framework, because most Adventure Paths that are 3 books long go from 1st to 11th, or they go from 11th to 20th. So it's easy to match those together, not so much with this one. So there are a couple of options you could do. The first is there's the beginner's box, Troubles in Otari. You could do that at 1st level through 3rd level, maybe 4th, and then move them into the forest. You might have to create your own little story to move them to that location, and it's also required that all of the players are considered friends of the lodge at the beginning of the campaign. That's why they're invited to the gala. So you might have like a level or so there that you create your own story to move them to that location and ingratiate them into that community. Another thing that popped up online that some people recommended, there is a Pathfinder Society scenario. It is scenario 1-22. It's called Doom of Casimir. I've never got involved with Pathfinder Society. I've not read this scenario, this adventure, but apparently it's for levels 1 to 4. It takes place in Talador, and some people say that it could be good connective tissue between the nation of Talador leading into the forest that it neighbors, and that could be a good entry into this. What to do afterwards? Not a whole lot of options for high level. You could do Night of the Great Death. That's a standalone adventure that is high level. I've not read that one yet, so I can't really say I recommend it one way or another. I just know that it has a level range that takes place post the conclusion of this campaign. I think personally, I wouldn't do anything before or after. I think, this itself, I think, is a satisfying campaign. Narratively, I would probably start my players at 5th level, maybe do a session 0 that might tie into a little bit of the nature stuff and why they're friends with the lodge. But I don't think I would even look for something to go from 1st to 5th and then pick this up and then find something to take you from 14th, 15th through 20th afterwards. I personally think players would be perfectly satisfied with this campaign the way it is. I will say that if you do want to kind of create your own adventure to fill in some gaps, in the book it says that 3 years prior to the start of the adventure, violent events like the Broken Bridge incident and the brief 7-stump war drive even greater tension in the area. I cannot find any mention online of what the Broken Bridge incident is or what the brief 7-stump war is. But that could be, imagination fuel for you. You could work something in to explain what those are, create it yourself, what the 7-stump war was or what the Broken Bridge incident was and how your players were involved and how they come out of that adventure as 5th level characters who are friends of the lodge. That's an option as well. So there you have it. General ideas and areas of concern, especially from the online community for Wardens of Wildwood. Overall, I think it looks like a fun, decent adventure path. I do think there are some valid concerns early on about the rise of Ruzadoya's power and the fact that you never learn who killed Valenar the Green or what that person's motive was. That's just a random act of violence that just happened to set off this whole other conflict. But I think it's a largely competent adventure path. I like the through line through the entire adventure. I think it's kind of cool to go to the elemental plane of wood towards the end. I like the fact that you can befriend Ruzadoya before she becomes undead. So yeah, I think there's a lot to enjoy with this campaign. If you have players who are super into the thought of primal themed characters and adventure, this would probably be a great fit for them. So if you have any questions, concerns, any insights, if you have GM'd or played this campaign, please leave those thoughts in the comments below. And as always, I want to take a moment to say thank you to everybody out there who supports me and this channel, whether that's by clicking the like button, subscribing, buying a super thing, subscribing to the Patreon. I really appreciate everything you folks do to support me. And with that, thanks for watching, take care, and happy gaming.